people are still trickling in, but I would just go and get started because we only have 1 hour. Welcome, everyone, to Stimson's webinar on America First Foreign Policy and its implications. My name is Yuki Tatsumi. I'm a co-director of the East Asia program and also director of Japan program here at Stimson Center. I am delighted to host these 3 panelists this morning to have a conversation about, obviously, there has been so much happening around the world, most recently in the Middle East, many surprise twists and turns of the event, and what does that mean for U.S. American foreign policy moving forward, and also what is the regional implication, not just in Middle East, but also beyond, specifically in Europe. As we're gathering here today, NATO summit is still ongoing, and then also joined by the leaders from the Indo-Pacific 4 partner nations. So how would make out all this? I think these 3 panels will help us understand how to dissect and analyze and look at this. Just wanted to make sure that everyone understands that when you do write in your questions, please do use Q&A box in your Zoom screen, and we will be that way. I'll be able to make sure that I don't miss anyone's question. Let me quickly introduce our 3 wonderful panelists in the order of which I am turning to speak. First, we have Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs and Ambassador at Large for Small Arms. He is also our board chairman of the board emeritus at Stimson. Secondly, we have Ellen Leibson, again, President Emeritus of the Stimson, and also a distinguished fellow. She is a long time observer of the Middle East affairs, so I'm really excited to hear her thoughts. Last but not least, we have Kuni Miyake, Senior Special Advisor at the Kennan Institute of Global Studies, and he's, again, another one of the longtime foreign policy advisor and foreign policy observer out of Japan, but his view really cut across the region. He's an Arabist and a Middle Eastern specialist by training, but he has numerous assignments across the globe. So super excited to hear all your thoughts. We're going to ask them to comment first, and then I would try to open it up to everyone's question and answer as soon as I can. So with that, welcome everybody. And let me first start with you, Link. You have covered pretty much everywhere as your portfolio when you were in the government, playing various roles. And now looking at the really surprising turn of events in the Middle East, and world leaders are gathering in The Hague for NATO summit. So if I can start with you by if you can just share your initial assessment of where things are and how you think things are going to evolve.
Well, thank you very much, Yuki. Hello to our people who have tuned in. Thanks for tuning in. It's an honor to be invited by Yuki and also to share a podium with 2 of my most esteemed colleagues and dear friends, Ellen Leibson and Kuni Miyake. What I'd like to do is start by giving you kind of a bottom line up front, which is to say strategic analysis of these events may not be the greatest guide to what is going to happen and how best to navigate relations with the United States and with the Trump administration. President Trump's superpower is his communication skill, and he lives for his narratives. And I think what I want to say about the Iran situation may be applicable in NATO as well, where they've just announced that they want to increase defense spending to 5%, something which the Secretary of Defense is saying Japan should do. These are derivative of President Trump lining up narratives that he can say, I changed things, I changed them for the better, I was the one who was able to do it. And I believe the Iran situation is very much reflective of that. What I want to say is that the Iranian leadership has been in power for 46 years. They've done it all. They've been through a lot. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, was president as of early 1981, which was a very important year. And let me start with a couple of numbers, because I have always been suspicious about how the Iran leadership uses the nuclear issue. It took the Soviet Union and the United States 6 years to build a bomb in the 1930s and 40s. It has taken other countries, France, Britain, ultimately Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea, anywhere from 6, 7, 10, 11, maybe 12 or 13 years for North Korea. Some, like Pakistan, didn't test until India tested, and Israel has never tested. Iran has been enriching uranium. They've had this secret enrichment program for 37 years. And I'm sorry, you can't tell me that if they had wanted the bomb, they wouldn't have had it a long time ago. And so why don't they want the bomb? And this is where I'm sure Kuni and Ellen can fill in, but clearly they know that Saudi Arabia since 2008 has said, if they get one, we'll get one. And Prince Mohammed bin Salman has repeated this many times, as did his predecessors. I heard it directly in a non-official meeting with the Crown Prince, Prince Sultan, in 2008 after they announced their program. So there's that. And it will probably drive Saudi Arabia more readily into the arms of normalization with Israel, which has a deliverable nuclear program. And the Gulf would then be strategically off limits to the dreams of Ayatollah Khomeini's Shia kingdom, the whole thesis of Karbala to Quds. We're going to have a Shia kingdom that ends up at Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. So then the final point is, ask yourself, if death to Israel is your mantra and you have a bomb, what are you going to do? Are you going to shoot it at Israel and perhaps affect Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was, after all, the purpose of the Hamas attack on October 7, 2023, was to defend the honor of Al-Aqsa Mosque, Al-Aqsa flood, against Jewish incursion. So there's a lot of contradictions that hold back the Iranians. And my point is that there's a deeper story there that Iran has never wanted to be told. And it's never heard in Washington because we're obsessed with the nuclear issue and we're more busy with China, Russia, Gaza, ISIS and other issues. And so Iran has gotten away with a lot. They have been now accused of deposing the elected government in 1981, shooting their way to power, 500,000 people in the streets. Khamenei took over a reign of terror, which the UN has now said involved genocide of tens of thousands of modern Muslims who wanted political rights as well as a different version of Islam. They were all killed. In 1988, a crime against humanity, up to 30,000 political prisoners were rounded up and executed. The most eminent scholar of Islam in Iran, who should have been the next supreme leader, complained bitterly and was sidelined. And then Khamenei was elevated as a loyal regime, Hojatollah Islam. He was made Grand Ayatollah and supreme leader. To prove himself, he engaged in a spree of terrorism around the world. Argentina bombings, killing the Americans at Khobar Towers, assassinations in Paris, Geneva, Turkey, Japan, the translator of Salman Rushdie's satanic verses, and on and on. And frankly, I think the nuclear talks in Europe were in some ways a cover for their desperate attempt to keep the Assad regime in power, which they now admit they spent $50 billion in Syria in that intervention, which drove 6 million Syrians out of the country. We didn't really focus on that. So you go on. And the last one is October 7th, 2023. The evidence is abundant that Iran approved the attack. They knew about the attack. They were tweeting in English about the attack that day. And yet the US intelligence community said they were surprised, and they assessed that they didn't know about it and were caught by surprise. And of course, the late foreign minister, Abdullahian, who died in the helicopter crash with Raisi, said, well, if the Americans bring more forces to the region, we can't maintain ourselves as a bystander. My point is, Iran's regime has been on thin ice from the day that it really took power. And they have committed horrendous crimes, which they've hidden and concealed, and then used propaganda and deception, which Washington started to pick up in the mid-90s and has repeated for 30 years. So there's a lot of things they've had to say that you've heard about Iran, which I dismiss as being propaganda and falsehood. I've researched them. And right now, so now comes the Trump attack. He's listening to Putin, who doesn't really want to see Iran diminished. Iran is giving him drone technology, missile technology. He needs Iran as part of the resistance coalition. He's listening to Bibi Netanyahu, who doesn't want sort of the chaos to end, because then he'll face, a commission of inquiry on October 7, and if he loses power, he'll have to face the corruption trial again. So he's doing a lot of things which may be strategically valuable, attacking the regime and the regime leadership, which is on, as I say, in very perilous condition. The president's listening to him saying, "Do it, do it, do it," and then he's listening to the MAGA loyal base, which he promised he would never get into another forever war in the Middle East. George W. Bush is actually more of a sort of a counterpart than the Democrats in that respect. And so by bombing Iran, something we've never done, the president stepped over quite a bright line compared to all presidents, and took some risk. But I think he calculated he could sell it. And so now you have him saying, well, we completely obliterated their nuclear program. And now the term obliterated, the vice president repeated it. Pete Hegseth is now calling on the FBI to investigate anyone who's questioning the battle damage assessment. And you have Steve Witkoff, the negotiator, saying it's treason to leak that maybe we didn't get it all. And by the way, if you did get it all, why would there be any nuclear negotiation? There's nothing to negotiate. So they're caught in a little bit of a jam, and he's on to the NATO summit, and hopefully he wants to put this behind him. The most curious point of all is the president saying that it's okay for Iran to sell oil to China. To me, that is sort of a lifeline to a regime which is on the verge, perhaps, of a possibly falling after 46 years, with a lot of support from Iranian women, girls, and people across the country, and a lot of international hope that maybe the Iranians can find their way to a more peaceable regime. The JCPOA was a good faith attempt to limit the program and see if Iran would reform over the years. Why else would you have sunset clauses in 2023, 2025, 2030, unless you thought Iran would become more moderate? They didn't. So President Trump needs to, his people, if they were thinking strategically, would say this didn't happen. They're never going to moderate. We now know that their biggest fear is Gorbachev and Glasnost. They will fall faster if they reform. So they're just going to double down. But so throwing them a lifeline with oil to China may relate to the 2-week deadline for tariff changes. He's trying to warm up Xi Jinping for a deal on tariffs. So I think our friends in Japan need to really think about narratives and think about President Trump. How is he most comfortable selling whatever he does with Japan? And I must say that there's a few clouds in the horizon. So I'll stop there and invite my colleagues to comment.
Fascinating. So with that, Ellen, let me turn to you, because obviously these decisions made by the President Trump, and then also the narrative that he's sharing with everyone, really kind of put the U.S. Partners in the Gulf in a kind of an interesting position. So help us understand how that dynamic is going on right now from your vantage point.
Okay, thanks so much, Yuki. I do want to go back eventually to very important point that Link made about really trying to make sure we truly understand what Iran's intentions were. And there's a very interesting Japan connection. So let me just throw out, basically, I'll turn back to this in a minute, the notion of whether Iran's nuclear experts were actually looking to Japan as a model of being a latent nuclear power, sort of demonstrating that you had the technology, the know-how, but no political or policy decision to actually go to weaponization. So I heard many Iranians make this argument. We didn't buy it. We didn't trust the Iranians. The contrast between Japan and Iran was over really an absence of trust to some extent. Mm-hmm. But it little bit picks up on Link's very interesting discussion of, why couldn't they, if they had really wanted a bomb, they could have gotten to the finish line by now. And so how do we understand that? But now let me step back, because the title of this conversation is about America First. And I think that if we contrast America First and alliances, we get two very different concepts of the role of the nation state in international politics, right? So Trump has now reversed what it was an 80-year tradition in the United States. that we are not just a nation looking after protecting our own borders and being sort of using our national security to kind of focus more inward than outward, but we have always ascribed to ourselves, and I think much of the world accepted this premise, that the US had some unique capabilities to play this global leadership role. And you can argue over the Cold War versus, great power competition, but it was pretty baked into the American national security culture that we do have responsibilities and obligations beyond our borders, and a deep belief, perhaps more among liberal internationalists than more conservative thinkers, that that role accrues benefits to the United States, that we're not just being altruistic in helping other countries achieve their security to prevent future world wars, but we are also benefiting from our partner countries or allied countries being prosperous and at peace themselves, that there is direct net value to the United States in playing that role. So Trump has clearly rejected that concept that, alliances and cooperation among countries is the way to achieve everybody's security, and that security of others is also security for the United States. He goes back to this America First concept, which is, many people have said, 19th century idea that, the US is just wants to behave like a normal country, that we look after our borders, we look after our citizens, but we don't take on this larger role. And yet Trump himself plays such a powerful role on the world stage because of that legacy of 80 years of American leadership. So he has benefited himself from it in terms of promoting, American interests the way he has done in, demanding Iran and Israel stop firing missiles at each other, and expecting compliance. So he's paradoxical in some ways, that America First doesn't always translate into the kind of selective activism that we see from President Trump. He's not activist on everything. There are many problems in the world that he's not interested in, but when he wants to play an active role, and he's sending these mixed signals between, I have the greatest military in the world, but I'm really a peacemaker. So he sends these, these different signals. I want to go back to, Yuki, you will remember, and Link, you'll remember our wonderful late colleague, Alan Romberg, who really created the Asian programs at the Stimson Center, was very fastidious about the use of the word alliance. And he was always a little bit critical of people using alliance in a very loose way. Whenever two countries have shared interests, they're in an alliance relationship, or that we use the word ally in a very kind of non-specific way. He was quite insistent that we make a distinction between formal alliances that are mutually binding, legal, usually ratified by parliaments, go through a long political process, and they are open-ended, or they have some enduring political commitment on the part of those, the participants to an alliance, versus today's world, where we have these ad hoc coalitions, coalitions of the willing, partnerships, etc. So in the case of the Gulf, we don't really have formal alliances. So we should be careful to not call the Gulf Arabs, or Israel. Israel doesn't want a formal alliance with the United States. This has been a principle of the Israeli state from the beginning, that they will never be dependent on another country for their own survival. So it was a high principle for the Israelis, even though you could certainly argue that their reliance on American weapons makes them codependent with us. But as in terms of any formal legal binding alliance with the United States, they have avoided that, and they've come up, we have security cooperation agreements. Link did a lot of this work, had that diplomatic responsibility when he was assistant secretary of, working out various bilateral arrangements with countries, that were legal agreements, but they were not necessarily formal alliances. And I'm sure Link can add a lot more on that. So now let's just turn to the specifics of the Gulf countries. I think they still see a net benefit of a deep security partnership with the United States. They have trained a couple of generations of their own military forces based on CENTCOM and sometimes NATO, but particularly CENTCOM's input and engagement. They prefer, Western weapons to whatever the Chinese and Russians may be selling, et cetera. At the same time, they want to preserve their independence. And I think increasingly, even the Saudis have said to us, we want to continue this relationship. We want to deepen it. We want to make it more meaningful. But you don't dictate our China policy. We're not a subordinate player when it comes to our own relations with China. You won't dictate to us what our China policy can be. So now, not unlike what the Iraqis have experienced a number of times, trying to balance, relations with the US and relations with, in Iraq's case, its immediate neighbor, Iran, or in the Gulf case, relations with China, can sometimes be quite problematic. And I think the Qataris genuinely expressed dismay and really kind of displeasure that the United States jumped on board the Israeli military operation against Iran's nuclear sites, because they saw that as putting them in the hot spot. And sure enough, the Iranians chose the El Obeid air base in Qatar as their target for retaliation. But it was pretty performative. It was symbolic. It was not, and they warned the Qataris in advance. So Qatar was able to escape any true terrible costs in either, civilian damage or make the Qataris really question their relationship with the United States. But my point is that as these countries become more self-confident and are genuine players on the global scene, on the one hand, I think they still very much value their security relationship with the United States, and they are nervous that, Trump's campaign rhetoric would have suggested that we would have significantly reduced the number of troops that we have deployed in these various outposts. So they want to hold on to that, and they want to demonstrate that they are independent, sovereign actors. So they have their own version of America First. They have their own version of, we look after our national interests, and we want this special security partnership with the United States. I should mention that, sometimes in the US system, we don't even understand, different constituencies in the United States, I think, don't fully understand the role that Qatar has played. When the October 23 attack by Hamas happened, there was a whole reaction that said, it's Qatar's, Qatar is somehow complicit in this because Qatar has had good offices of Hamas in Doha. We have asked the Qataris to host the Taliban, to host Hamas, to play that intermediary role with Iran. But parts of our security system see Qatar as untrustworthy, unreliable, when the executive branch has to sometimes step up to the plate and say, no, actually, this is a role the Qataris are well positioned to play, and it helps the United States even if it looks like we have completely divergent policies. So I think I'll end there. But, again, my main point is we should not use that alliance concept to apply to all of these relationships. They really are, they have to be studied with a little more specificity, I think.
Thank you, Ellen. And it's interesting that you reminded us of Alan's carefulness with the word alliances, because I heard by talking to another colleague not too long ago that their criticism nowadays is that we throw in partners, like, make it as like almost interchangeable, like allies and partners as like a set, when they're actually mean two different relationships. So that's interesting that you reminded us about the Alan's carefulness with that terminology as well. Great. So you're going to be the cleanup of all of us.
Well, I don't have much to add. Free to respond. Although I am supposed to be a Middle East expert, I don't have much to add after listening to Ellen and Link, who are experts on this. But first of all, I'd like to tell the people listening to us or watching us, Link was Assistant Secretary when I arrived in Washington, D.C. in 1991, I guess. And I was a Paul Mill officer and a Middle East officer at the Japanese embassy. Then Clinton came and Ellen came to NSC. So, those good old days are gone. I'm afraid. You see, we're talking about alliance, we're talking about the values. They're gone. And so very unfortunate, but I really believe that something is changing in your country, the United States. Is it socio-political or generational? I don't know, but something is happening. But that's not the topic I like to talk about today, because I have to talk about my takeaways from the so-called what I call U.S. Israel-Iran war or whatever conflict. So the following, I have multiple takeaways or lessons learned from this recent event. So I'd like to share them with you. Number one, first and foremost, I'm learning how to convince a U.S. president who is very reluctant to militarily intervene overseas. I thought that Mr. Trump will never interfere, but actually he did. And I think it's a great lesson for potentially Taiwan, because Israel did a great job. I think it's I call it strategic piece of art. They bring the United States into their war against Iran, at least temporarily. So the lessons I learned, if my assumption is correct, number one, in order to bring the Americans into your war, then you need to have enough military power so that you can fight by yourself. That's number one. And also you have to show determination. That means you be able to fight and bleed for your existence. And then, most importantly, you must look winning. You see, you cannot lose. That's probably few of the reasons why Trump might have changed his mind, according to New York Times and other reports. So, however, unlike Israel, Taiwan does not have special relationship with the United States. So this is the difference, but I think it's a big lesson for Taiwan, and to a lesser extent to Japan. See, how can we convince a reluctant U.S. president who doesn't want to be involved in military conflict overseas? That's the number one, first and foremost, the lesson I learned. Second takeaway is completely different. The important role of the intelligence services. The remarks made by Mr. Trump. So the U.S. intelligence services are wrong. They're wrong. I said, oh my God, the intelligence services should be fact-based, and they should be non-political, professional sort of organizations. But Mr. Trump denied their activities. They denied the intel analysis. And it really reminded me of the failure just before the Iraq War. If you deny the professional analysis of the intelligence services and politicize those pieces of information, you lose a war. And that's exactly what happened to Japan before 1941. We wanted to see the best sort of rosy scenario, and regardless of the reality. So I was stunned by Mr. Trump's remarks about the denial of the outcome of the intelligence services. This is the second takeaway of mine. So that means, simply put, we cannot trust the Trump administration's judgment. unfortunately. Number three, third takeaway is it's so interesting, the comparison between the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater vis-a-vis the Middle East. For the US allies in East Asia, unlike Ukraine, unlike European theater, the Gulf area is much, much more strategically important for the following two reasons. Number one is that Gulf is the source of our energy supply for Japan, for South Korea, and other Southeast Asian countries, and of course, China as well. So Ukraine doesn't help us energy-wise, but the Gulf is extremely important. Number two, the similarity, the strategic, or I would say, military sort of similarity between the Gulf or Middle Eastern theater and the Indo-Pacific theater, because we need naval forces and we need air force. Unlike Ukraine, which is basically ground war with some air power. But I was scared to death when Mr. Trump started preparing for the military attack against the nuclear facilities in Iran. They mobilized 3 air carrier battle groups, or task force, or whatever they call. You see, there are 3 carriers in the neighborhood, but part of them from the 7th Fleet. The 5th Fleet is not enough. So if something happens in the Gulf, probably some portion, at least some portion of the 7th Fleet or the Indo-Pacific Command's forces should be introduced to the Gulf area. And that has been a nightmare of mine for the past 20, 30 years. But given the fact that the US and Iran finally started fighting each other directly, then my nightmare is going to be a reality. That's what I'm very much worried about. So the contingencies for the 5th Fleet and the 7th Fleets are quite similar in nature. And this is an ultimate example, typical example of the zero-sum game between the Middle Eastern theater and the Indo-Pacific theater. That's the third takeaway. Finally, the biggest potential loser in this game, if there's any, is not Iran? Maybe not. United States, of course not. I think the biggest potential loser may be China for 2 reasons. Number one, they are also heavily dependent on the stability in Iran because they buy so much oil from Iran, and also the stability in the Gulf region. So what if there's a blockade, naval blockade by or Strait of Hormuz, and could be a counter blockade by the U.S. Navy to allow the non-Iran related vessels to go through the Gulf, or through the Strait, but stop all the shipment from to Iran, including the Chinese oil. So that's I think it could be a nightmare for China, and Hormuz blockade will stop Iranian oil flow to China. This is the reality. And China, despite the fact that they claim that they did mediation work between Saudi Arabia and Iran a few years ago, maybe 2023, but I never trusted the value of it because the Qataris or Omanis have been working on it for years, and probably China had just took advantage of the last sort of best portion of the pie, piece of pie. But unfortunately, given the United States is heavily involved in this like this, China cannot do a lot. And this is the simple reality I learned from this game. Finally, I've been telling my audience these days, since a long time ago, I've been asking them, why do you think the Americans maintain presence in the Gulf? And they ask, their answer is, protect the Saudis? Protect the Israelis? No. Of course, they are true, but also the most important countries to protect, for the United States to protect by maintaining presence in the Gulf is the U.S. allies in East Asia, because we are heavily dependent on that. So I think I have to stop here, and I like to make much more comments, if I may, after in the second round. Thank you.
Great. For some reason, Kuni-san, your camera has been turned off. So if you can figure it out to turn it back on again, that'll be great.
Yes,
so
yes.
With that, I actually have a couple of interesting questions from the audience already that could actually move our conversation a little further. So let me start you off with those. So this is really for anybody who would like to take up on it. One is about, as picking up on Kuni's reference to impact in Asia, China and Russia haven't done much to help Iran, which is supposed to be a member of the CRNK grouping. So what does the recent development tell us about China, Russia, Iran, North Korea partnership or relationship? And will Kim Jong-un rethink quote unquote alliance with Russia, given what just happened?
Are you asking me?
Anybody? No, for anyone who would like to pick up on it.
Please.
I guess
because
maybe
I was
I'll
working
go
on the
from,
camera. I was working
okay.
on my camera.
So maybe I'll turn to you, Link, real quick, and then Ellen, while Kuni's figuring out the visual.
So when you see hostilities arise and missiles flying back and forth, I would think for a country who's not even in the region, the idea of somehow putting yourself in the line of fire in some way is the last option that you would ever want. Specifically, Russia, has its hands full. You hear both views. The line is moving westward in Ukraine, but at high cost. Putin seems to be able to absorb high losses, but there is a lot of evidence that his economy and that Russia itself is just becoming weak for the long term because of this war in Ukraine. For China, I mean, and I'll leave it to other experts, Kuni and Yuki, but there is evidence that Xi Jinping is sort of involved in a little bit of a political competition at the highest levels. He didn't go to the BRIC summit, and there's a lot of talk about Xi's position. Is he being blamed for isolating China too much in the world economy and having supply chains being cut off from China? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that independent of the Iranian oil, he needs 4.1 million barrels a day of oil, plus some LNG from Qatar every day out of the Strait of Hormuz, as Kuni just said. So the idea, if the Chinese are influencing Iran at all, it would be, please don't close the strait. That would be number one. And of course, Kuni points out that Japan and Korea are treaty allies, and they have daily important imports of fossil fuels from the Gulf. So I think China has no leverage in a war in the Middle East. So I think they're just sitting back hoping that Iran survives. If there were a change in Iran, If first of all, I don't think it would be like Libya. I think the Iranian people are over 90 million people. Many of them are highly educated. They have long millennia of history and culture. There's a thought that the Iranians would do a good job picking themselves up. There'd be a lot of division between those who are trying to change the regime, which is a legacy of the regime dividing and conquering with propaganda and other tools of influence. But, you wouldn't have had October 7th, 2023. The Hamas attack would never have happened if there had been a more modern, peaceful, cooperative regime in Tehran. And nor would all of these things. I could spend an hour just listing the dossier of crimes across Europe, across North America. It's really, and more executions per capita than anywhere in the world by far, including under this moderate Pezeshkian, more so than even under Raisi, who was accused of war crimes in 1988. So the point is, the Chinese are standing back, hoping for the best, and maybe reaching out to President Trump and saying, look, on the tariff thing, can we talk? And so why did President Trump suddenly say that Iran can sell oil to China? I think I don't know. Fox News is talking about Nobel Peace Prize. So maybe it's because he has a vision of what he can accomplish in a negotiation with Tehran. Maybe it's because he's hearing from Xi Jinping and wants to settle the tariff dispute and claim victory there. Either way, it's about the narrative, and it's about the president's ability to say, I fixed it. That's what it's about. So I would reverse engineer all of the analysis in Asia and Japan through the lens of what is President Trump's winning narrative.
Yuki?
Yeah. Yes, of course.
Okay, so I think Link really set up an interesting concept that I had meant to mention earlier, which is that Trump doesn't think of international relations as relationships between states and institutions. He thinks of it as relationships between leaders. And so that's terribly important to him. So even if we are, from the outside, tempted to see this China, Russia, North Korea, Iran as a kind of new version of axis of evil, axis of resistance, whatever you want to call it, I'm sure Trump doesn't think of it that way. He's tried to break Russia and China by pulling Russia away from its relationship with China. And the Iranians may have expected some reciprocal support from Russia, given all that Iran has done for Russia in Ukraine, but they didn't get it. Now we're living in a little bit of a pause bubble right now, which is that the kinetic part of this struggle seems to have abated for now. We don't know whether, as Cooney said, there might still be a chance for this to burst into a regional conflagration that we all dread. But for now, it looks like we're in between, war and peace. So maybe some of that high angst about what Russia and China will do will come down a bit. But again, I think it's comparable to Link's point, in a way says it just a little bit differently, is that Trump's belief in his own personal persuasion powers are that he could engage the Iranians directly, like he tried to engage the North Koreans directly at the leadership level, and make deals. This is still different than enduring partnerships, alliances, treaties, whatever you want to call them. But that's the way he operates, and he seems to have demonstrated that he has coercive power. Does he really have peacemaking power? Does he really understand the complexities of, because other countries have their own version of America first. They're going to look after their own national interests. They're not going to succumb at the first glance. So anyway, that's just one point I wanted to make.
That's an interesting point. Go ahead, Kuni-san.
Yes, the Trump's statement that Iran, you can sell oil to China. I think this is a message to a leader-to-leader message to maybe Khamenei and Xi Jinping. To Khamenei, hey, you can sell oil to China, at least for now. So we're not going to kill you, we're not going to destroy you, so give up the nuclear weapons. Okay, but it's not going to work because Iran is determined. They want to survive. They know that Saddam didn't survive. and Kim Jong-un survives. So that's why I think the Iranians are determined to continue the nuclear ambition. And also a message to the Chinese, if there's any. Okay, we can stop your oil flow, Iranian oil flow to China. We can do that, but at least now we don't. So listen carefully. I think that's the message Mr. Trump might have thought that he could send to those two leaders.
Interesting. And then I found, Ellen, I found your comment about President Trump looks at relationship with other countries, not as country to country, but him and other leaders of those countries, because it still strikes me very incredible and remarkable that when he talks about Japan, he continues to talk about the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, even to the domestic audience who probably would have never heard of Mr. Abe. So that's kind of what I was thinking when I was listening to his speech in Pittsburgh when he first gave a green light to US Steel-Nippon Steel deal. But anyway,
how lucky we are.
Correctly, I would say that. So, kind of thinking in that vein on alliances and actually a liberal international order writ large. What is the feeling now, you think, from each of your perspective, about after 4 or 8 years' time that we've seen, well, first of all, Mr. Trump's presidency first term, and then 4 years of Biden, President Biden, and then now we're into the second cycle of 4 years of President Trump. Could America switch back to quote unquote normal again? Like when if next president comes in 4 years from now, and we build alliances and kind of resuscitate the respect for norms, international law, the UN Charter, UN system writ large. Again, this is for everyone who cares to take a stab at it. So, who would like to take up on that one?
Would it be?
I am the. Oh,
no, please, Kuni.
First.
Well, maybe I'll go to Kuni first, and then have Link follow.
Yes, very short. Very pessimistic I am. I'm telling my audience these days that those beautiful 80 years of World War period since 1945 may be ending. And whether we like it or not, we may be getting back to the pre-World War I era. Of course, history only rhymes. It doesn't repeat itself. So if that's the case, and given that, as I told you, the socio-political or generational transformation of the American political arena or community, or landscape, I would say this Trump phenomena is not a one-time sort of phenomena. It will continue at least for another 12. Well, I wouldn't say 8, if not 12 years. That's what I'm extremely worried about.
Link?
Well, I wanted to take an opportunity to say that when you invited me to speak about US-Japan and these other issues, I went back to look at the work of two great friends of the US-Japan relationship who we lost recently, Rich Armitage and Joe Nye, who wrote the Armitage-Nye report annually until the last one was last fall. And if you look at that report, it is all about architecture. It's all about institutions. It's all about upholding principles and the rules-based international order, tightening intelligence cooperation, tightening defense technology cooperation, making the U.S. and Japan a more modern alliance in the true sense of the word. And it's been a very sad season to see both of them go. We remember them both very fondly, and both are irreplaceable. So now where are we? What do we do without these two people overlooking this relationship? I don't know how to put a timetable on it, but the phenomenon that we're witnessing has to do with inequality in the world, economic inequality that has been accelerated by the digital age. And now with the media becoming much more profit-centered about how many people are watching, how many followers do you have, clicks, and all of that. And it has corrupted, I think, the idea of sort of responsible news collection and broadcasting. The think tank community is somewhat sidelined, to be honest, under the current administration, where the president is actually intuitively the most intelligent leader following this media trend. He is riding the wave more than anyone ever has. And we need to understand it, and others will do the same. But I believe that there's a very strong reservoir of common sense of people who say, look, we want ethics, we want decency. If the new economic bill gives a lot more money to the rich and disadvantages the poorest among America, and there's a huge addition to the national debt, that's not a narrative the president will want, although he hasn't figured out how to overcome it. So he's pressuring the rest of the world to give him more concessions on trade. Japan, 25% tariffs on cars. That is unacceptable to Prime Minister Ishiba, as Kuni knows, and he didn't go to NATO. They've canceled the 2+2 foreign and defense minister meeting when the US called for 5% defense spending. I worry that the friction that's being caused by these changes and artificial intelligence will have an impact that we haven't even calculated yet. One impact that I predict is that AI will not be as competent as a human being in certain respects. It'll be more competent in some ways, and it'll make big mistakes in other ways that a human wouldn't have made. And this is going to cause harm as well. So we have a lot of work to do. I'm not convinced that it's an irrevocable slide away from, sort of sensible, responsible, institutional stability. I think we will find our way back, but we're not going to find it right away.
Ellen, anything to add?
So I think I'm somewhere in between Kuni and Link. I would say the same thing as Kuni, that you can't turn the clock back, but I don't say it as a pessimist. I say it maybe as a realist, that we have to embrace some kind of evolutionary change in the international system. The system doesn't feel stable right now. It feels very wobbly in terms of whether is there enough kind of center of gravity of the views of particularly the great powers, but also let's talk about the middle powers. The middle powers will be playing a bigger role in defining, what are the boundaries of how international institutions can function. If we have this trend towards non-interventionism and kind of less promotion of democratic values as the aspirational goal for all countries. I just wanted to make a slightly different point, which is that Biden was not the right messenger for the restoration of the old order. I mean, the tragedy of Biden was that he maybe should have had his chance to be president earlier, but he represented almost a nostalgia for the old order, not as effective as a sort of revalidating or revitalizing the existing order. So I do think it's I think his presidency was in many ways tragic, that he was the wrong guy at that moment, even though he so deeply believed in the core values of the post-45 world order. But we need to be able to shift by some degrees in what is an acceptable set of practices and protocols for international cooperation. And, it shouldn't be just the Chinese getting to call the shots, although they might think in fairness, America defined the shots for almost a century. Now maybe it's our turn. But one hopes for the rise of the middle powers, some, more moderate center of gravity that would revalidate these institutions, but accept that they have to adapt to new circumstances.
Ellen, I agree with you. I just want to make a short comment. Japan still withhold those values and free and open rule-based international order. And so many European countries agree with us. So some Americans may not understand it for a while. So during that time, we have to keep those countries together. And we have to keep it as we did. Remember, the TPP 12 and the United States left. So we still withheld TPP 11. That's something that we might have to pursue in the future.
That is a very interesting point. So given that, this will be the last question. And going back to the title of this event, which is America First Foreign Policy. In this time of a very kind of unstable, unpredictable, in a sense, very fluid time, how do you see America's role of the U.S. in the current situation, and how is that dynamics between the U.S. and countries like Ellen and Kuni were talking about, middle powers, those who still hold those values and norms? How do those dynamics play out for a while? I guess, 4, 8, 12 years. I guess let's just randomly say 8, because that's like 2 full presidential terms. I would just ask anybody who would like to start. Maybe Ellen, can I start with you?
So, I take Kuni's point that, there are still maybe 20 or 30 countries that would be able to articulate how the international system should work. And we do have to hope that some of that sort of muscle memory continues, that there's certain, institutionalized gatherings, whether it's the G20 or the UN General Assembly in the fall, although I think people see that as very limited in its impact now, of whether some of that continuity will be minimally sufficient. I look at CENTCOM. There was a question in the Q&A about, why haven't we reduced our military presence if that's the plan? Well, the military will argue quite effectively for as much continuity as possible. They don't want radical change. They don't want, so here you have CENTCOM in the Middle East, knowing that the gravitational pull for 20 years has been move more assets to the Indo-Pacific region and sort of downsize our commitment to the Middle East. And it hasn't happened. There has been a lot of continuity. So I can't go much beyond that of saying that those institutional relationships do matter. But at the top, we have, the leaders of the great powers are having a totally different conversation. So it's hard to connect the two.
Any others for the last word?
Well, I'll give you a quick follow-up to Ellen's comment. I don't know how long President Trump will be president. That's number one. So as long as he is, I think he wants to steer the narrative toward victory. So part of it is largely economic. There's a lot of effort going on to deregulate, make the data centers and there's a lot of effort. He signed a lot of executive orders that will promote nuclear power and whatnot to power data centers. There are people promising high investment, including the Prime Minister of Japan, including some Middle Eastern leaders. That's what he really wants. I think he wants to be able to reorient some trade relationships in ways that involve investment in the U.S. When he does that, the U.S. will have a huge economic boom, probably of some magnitude, and hopefully he'll stabilize some relations on a friendly basis. Once he's no longer president, what happens then? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do think it's an open question and a generational question and a legacy question to sort of rediscover what's important here. We need to stop wars in the world. We need to arrest the heat, the warming of the planet. We need to make sure that the poorest countries in the world don't generate, mass migration and and pandemic and whatnot. So there's a lot to be done there. And I think we'll rediscover those things and focus on them, but I don't know how or when.
Kuni, would you like a last word?
Well, it's very short. It may sound wishful thinking, but I hope that there should be like-minded, serious, thoughtful, wise group of Americans, not only in Washington, D.C., but elsewhere. I want them to speak out, and I like to echo them. Together with them, probably we may be able to make a small but important change. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much to all of you for your wonderfully insightful thought. This was a fascinating conversation. I hope the audience will feel that you'll walk away from this feeling the same. Thank you again for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you're chiming in. Please just stay tuned for a future announcement from the East Asia programming. And I'd like to thank all three of you, Link, Ellen, and Kuni-san, again, for your thoughtful thoughts and time this morning and this evening. And this concludes the seminar. Thank you very much.